After a second teenager in just 24 hours has died amid calls to tackle the violence on the streets of London. David Lammy, Tottenham MP, Labour MP, has blamed the drug trade and public sector cuts after both a 16-year-old boy and a 17-year-old girl killed in completely separate shootings in North London. But we have seen now the 48 murders on the streets of London in the last, just this year, just since the beginning of January. A shocking figure. And we discussed yesterday on the show how our murder rate has now overtaken that of New York. But what is actually going wrong and how can we tackle it? Let's talk to Chris Hobbs. He's a former Metropolitan Police officer and joins us now. Good morning to you, Chris.
Yeah, morning,
Good
Julia.
morning. I've heard lots of different things blamed. So we're talking, it's public sector cuts, it's the drugs trade. Social media was being blamed for ramping up responses to perceived slights on social media, on Instagram or whatever. Surely the thing to blame is the fact that people have got knives and guns and they're willing to use them.
Well, that's part of it, and without a doubt. But also part of it is the fact that they are encouraged by social media. I know Cressida Dick got a lot of stick for her comments, but you need to really get under the skin of social media to see the huge influence it has. When you've got one gang member calling out another gang member who's still in prison, and it gets over 4 million views. Now, that shows the influence that these gang rappers have on gangs, people on the fringes of gangs, and on the youth population in general. It's a huge influence and one that's growing at an alarming rate. If you're talking about drugs, yes, most of those London gangs are very much into drug dealing. We've got county lining, haven't we, Julie? Remember the children that are being used to move drugs around? Yep. So we've got really a bit of a perfect storm. And police, rank and file police, people like myself, retired police officers have been warning over the last 2 or 3 years that this is coming. We've seen the signs, and without a doubt, the cuts have played a huge part in what's going on.
And in what way? Because we're told, there's nowhere for young people to go. But I mean, is that the issue, or is it the number of police officers who are on the street? Is it the intelligence? Where are the cuts manifesting themselves that are causing young people to kill each other over trifling insults?
Well, you've got different sorts of cuts, haven't you? You've got cuts to policing, and then you're looking at the cuts we've had to things like youth clubs and organisations that will try and put youths on the straight and narrow. The probation service is a shadow of what it was once because of cuts. So I think it's a combination. It's all these factors coming together to provide this perfect storm. And the police, as I say, are doing their best, but you might remember, Julia, 2 years ago, Theresa May, stop and search in her last election manifesto. She threatened to bring legislation in against police officers unless stop and search was reduced. Well, you don't hear that now, do you, from the Conservatives? Because what's happened, as I say, there are fewer police on the streets anyway to conduct stop and search. Neighbourhood policing is struggling to survive within London. So, as I say, you've got a combination of factors that are bringing what's now happening really is a tragedy on our streets.
Well, this is it. And this is the thing. It is a tragedy. And what has amazed me over the last, say, 5-10 years is how we've all just got used to the fact that we would just read about a teenager being killed. And if you look at these double-page spreads in the papers showing you they are invariably, 95% are young black or Asian men, largely black young men. And I have to say, it does not make it hard to say. I genuinely believe if they were white middle-class girls being gunned down on the streets or knifed in the streets and dying, the government would have the resources to solve this tomorrow because there'd be an outcry. Do we just not care about these young men? And the view seems to be, well, it's one gang member killing another gang member, but actually not looking into the backgrounds of why these young, some of them children, are actually joining gangs. And a lot of it is out of fear.
I think some of it is out of fear. I think you've got a situation where, because of fear, you've got people who aren't in gangs who are arming themselves. The police will say, well, this isn't gang-related. I think also what is frightening, and again, what's under the radar, is the fact that every month in London, you've got over 400 stabbings and shootings. Now,
not to mention the acid attacks.
That's right. Yes, absolutely. But how many of those do you read about? You only hear about them when the Met produces statistics every few months. Most of them are kept under the radar. Now, that could be because the media aren't really that interested, for perhaps reasons you've just said, or it could be, and I suspect it's a bit of both, the Met actually sit on some of this stuff because one or two at the top don't really want to alarm the public as to how serious the situation
But
is.
it's also the case that a lot of these, we talk about, this is awful. I mean, two murders of teenagers within a few miles of each other on one night. But the reality is that they are in very specific areas. A lot of these, that their gang crime is taking place in specific areas. It's not in the leafy streets where people like me live. So we can all go, well, it's not our problem.
Well, yes. To a certain extent, you can say that. But the other day, there was a serious a murder in Wandsworth, in the leafy streets, near where I live in West London, up in Northolt and Rayners Lane. You've got two gangs there. Murders have resulted. They're forever having a go at each other. Now, these are on the outer limits of London. Hayes, again in West London, you've got problems there with gangs. So it's like a spreading disease, really, that's spreading across London and spreading across the country as well.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not just in London. I mean, London's been the focus of this because of these recent shootings, but it's and knifings, but it has been going on in other major cities as well. But again, perhaps if we don't tackle it now, it will be in every single leafy street as well. Chris Hobbs, thank you for joining us, former Metropolitan Police Officer. I'll bring my guests Richard Angel and Russell Quirk in this very, very briefly before we get to the news. Richard, I mean, do you just despair of the fact that, as a general rule now, a teenager getting shot to death in our capital city is a news in brief rather than a front page story?
Yeah, we can't desensitise ourselves to the situation. Both The Sun and The Guardian have got amazing spreads where they outline the faces of all the young people who have been murdered across London, and it is pretty terrible. There's an amazing quote from a witness said her mum didn't deserve to watch her die, about the young woman that died this week, and it is just. But apparently, really
the victim of totally innocent victim of drive-by shooting.
Literally, and
again, that's not supposed to happen in England, is it?
It's not supposed to happen at all. And the problem is that where are the services for people to exit gangs, to get out of some of the problems that cause these things? I think that what that guy just talked about, a kind of perfect storm of cuts to public services in all the different areas have come together now in a really damaging.
But again, everything always comes back to money? Is it money, Russell?
Cuts are a red herring, aren't they? Let's be honest. Look, if there is a gang culture within certain parts of London, South London in particular, that's where the majority of these 48 murders have occurred this year. No matter how much money you spend on policing, I mean, youth clubs, look, come on, that's laughable. You're not going to change your gang for a youth club, and that's going to cure you of your
But youth
mindset.
workers do amazing work to exit people.
Notwithstanding that, absolutely. But you're not going to get this change of mindset where you go from being a potential murderer on the basis that you're in some kind of gang initiation ceremony, but you're going to be saved by going and playing snooker in a youth club. I mean, come on.
Exactly. I have to say, do you know what the one word that people don't mention? Fathers. I'd love to know how many of these victims and how many of these perpetrators have a father living in the home with them. Call me old-fashioned. Let's talk to Harriet Sergeant. Now, she's an author of a book called Among the Hoods, My Years with a Teenage Gang, after she met with teenage gang members to research a think tank report, and spent many years with them ever since, getting to know them. Harriet Sergeant, thank you so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure.
Always a pleasure to speak to you. Now, I mean, I first got to know you through actually reading your articles about this, because I thought it was so fascinating. This sort of posh middle-class woman, a middle-aged woman, sort of turning up to meet these gangs, in the hood. But that you took them under your wing, and they rather took you under their wing as well. And you got to know these gang members and got to know them over the years. From your knowledge and the young men and women that you've spoken to in gangs over all those years, why do you think that we are seeing this spate in gun and knife crime among gangs at the current time?
Well, I actually agree with Cressida Dick. I do think that it's got hugely much worse, and it's been exacerbated by social media. And this is because if you know anything about teenage boys, which I have to say a lot of people don't, they just treat teenage boys as if they're some sort of horrible sort of bout of bad weather that will go away. But if you know anything, that a boy will put something up on social media, and it is a public humiliation to another boy, and he has to respond. Otherwise, he loses all credibility. He becomes a kind of victim not only of that gang, but also of his friends. So he has to respond. And we're kind of pushing these boys who, if you took 10 boys, 3 of them might want to be in a gang, but 7 of them definitely don't want to be in one. And we're kind of pushing them into these confrontations, these violent, deadly confrontations that they don't want to do. And why we're not tackling social media and trying to stop this, I just don't know.
But isn't the fact that, say, so what someone says to you on social media will provoke that reaction? Doesn't that tell you something about the world in which they live? It's a question I mentioned earlier in the show. We were talking about this with a former Metropolitan Police officer. I wonder how many of these young boys have got fathers in their lives. I wonder how many of the boys with the knives and those who are the victims of the knife attacks or the gun attacks have fathers in their lives. Is there an issue here where we've got a total abject breakdown of sort of normal societal institutions like the family?
Well, I think that's perfectly true. I mean, I was astonished when the young boys I befriended, and they were about 15 when I got to know them. And so I saw them, it's now almost 10 years later, I've seen them go through the criminal justice system. And certainly when they started going to prison, I was amazed to find they actually enjoyed prison because it gave them a routine, it gave them gym, and they said they were older men for them to talk to. And for many, it was the first time they had ever spent time with older men.
And good, well, there's not good role models, but role models.
Had to go to prison to spend time with older men.
But this is the interesting thing that what seems fascinating is we're told children can't cope with rules. They opt out of school around. Usually, I think it's around 13, 14 is the biggest age for kids to drop out of school. Often they're semi-literate only by then, and they've not got this structure at home. And the funny thing is they are drawn to gangs because of the structure. It's almost like they want the structure and the routine and the hierarchy.
Well, exactly. I mean, I think the gangs give them exactly the void that they long and crave for, that we failed to give them, which is exactly what you said. I mean, gangs are very active, they're hierarchical, and they're extremely competitive. And what I found really interesting when I was doing my think tank report was to look at institutions that actually succeed with young boys, succeed with helping them transact from teenage boys to being grown-up men successfully. And actually, private boys' schools do succeed. But
it's easy to succeed with rich people's kids, isn't it?
Well, no, they succeed with boys. I mean, one of the reasons, if you look at what they give boys, for instance, hours of sport. I mean, just one very simple thing. I mean, on average, a state school will give teenage boys 1.5 hours of sport. It's not a week. It's not nearly enough. Public schools will give 5 hours of sport a week. And that is the kind of these, and they need it much younger. I mean, leaving it to 13 or 14 is too late. They should be being given something that they can be proud of. And this can be music, this can be art, this can be sport. And this should be happening in primary school. And unfortunately, it's not.
And we don't get them earlier. So in terms of what you think could be done, some of it does involve money. People are talking about Tory cuts being responsible. But we're not going to bring back sort of the family unit. We're not going to change all these housing estates overnight. If there's one thing that the government, the mayor, the police, the one thing that can be done tomorrow to try and start tackling this and prevent this loss of life, what can we do?
Well, that's very interesting. I think, all right, the one thing you could start doing tomorrow is more stop and search. Because stop and search, which has been, again, something else that's being poo-pooed. Actually, if you had police stopping and searching and finding knives and finding guns, that is going to save lives.
And it saves.
It has to be done. It has to be done. I mean, one of the things that just is extraordinary is that police don't seem to be able to recognise if somebody's black, they stop and search them. They don't seem to recognise if someone's a young black professional, middle class. They're still stopped and searched. Now, I can see the difference between
why can't they? But again, it's the young boys and girls who are actually terrified and carrying a knife, what they believe for protection, who are at the biggest risk, and that will actually protect them. Thank you so much for talking to us, Harriet Sergeant. I do advise you to read her book, fantastic book, Among the Hoods: My Years with a Teenage Gang. Thank you so much for joining us.